Alright, so my name is Denis Gorin, and I'm a freelance Rails developer for the past 4 years. Mainly I'm paying my tax in the Netherlands. By the way, do you know how high is the tax in the Netherlands? Any idea? Well, it's 52%, which is maximum, of course. It would start slower. Why I'm saying I'm paying the tax in the Netherlands, I do not really actually live there. So the past 4 years I've traveled around the world and lived in many different places, which in total brings me like to 30 plus countries. And I like this lifestyle, so I can plan to continue doing this. And I use a lot of website called Couchsurfing. Many of you must know about this, and you can try to find me there. It's basically it's hospitality network for people who travel a lot. So you can come to a city where you don't know anyone and then meet locals and maybe stay for free at someone's place. But alright, today we are going to talk about web applications, right? But not any web applications, but rather maybe it's better if I sit down. What do you think? So I don't have to move around here. Alright, so we are not going to talk about any web applications, but rather about something which we call rich internet applications or rich client-side applications. So the abbreviation is RIA, and which application are you going to call RIA? It's hard to draw the line after which you start calling an application RIA, but basically we can say that generally RIA applications make very heavy use of Ajax, right? And it's often just a single page application. And recently a lot of websites you see, even like Twitter and Facebook, they just do not reload the whole page ever. They just update the URL and the link bar with JavaScript. So I'm even going to talk more specifically about web applications of a specific, RIA applications of a specific kind. It's web applications that use or let you see and change a lot of data. So it makes heavy use of databases, and it's all kind of backends and CMSs and database admins and enterprise applications like logistics software and stuff, and data management applications in general, like logging and time trackers. It's something which you can envision like a lot of data on the screen and the tools to edit this data and somehow manipulate it. Another separate area, it would be the idea of moving the desktop applications to the web. So currently I'm working for a client that created forecasting application written in Visual Basic using Access. And his clients, of course, they like to access it via the internet. So what they do, they use the remote desktop to access his application. So of course, it's a good case to move this application to web. And we have many different tools probably to do Ajax and stuff. There are a lot of JavaScript libraries. But today I want to introduce you to something which is called EXTJS from Sencha. And I see very disappointed faces, bad experiences. I would advocate that it's a good tool for this kind of applications where you have a lot of data on the screen, because it has a consistent interface. It has all the widgets that you know from desktop applications, like windows, grids, and menus, and so on and so on, forms, trees. And I like it. It's has a very extended set of widgets which you can use out of the box, and it's extensible, right? So you can create your own widgets, you can combine the widgets that you have provided to you by Instantia, and it has very powerful architecture. In fact, it makes it very flexible and fun to work with. It has good documentation, and it's the forums are very supportive as well. But we are Rails developers, right? Sencha, XJS, it doesn't know anything about the backend, what's on the server, and it's server agnostic. So people connect it to Java, to PHP, but we want to connect it to Rails, of course. So how should we do this? I want to, before I suggest my own answer to this problem, I want to lead you through a few showcases of the applications that I'm mostly working on, and so that you can have the feeling about what an application with the XTJS might look like, and think a little bit about how you yourself would connect it to Rails, right? So let's start with this app, which I made for a logistics company that exports flowers to Eastern Europe from Holland. So, is there a light here? Yeah. All right. So basically, the two interesting elements here are two grids on the top and on the bottom. And in fact, you can see that it's a little bit more complex than this, because in the bottom you have tabs, which basically each of which contain another grid. So on the top grid, you see the number of trucks, vehicles that carry the orders, and the orders are listed in the grid below. All right, just give it a moment to think about how you would do this in Rails, because it's not only this view. There is much more to this. Oh, I cannot go. Yeah. Much more to this, because you see the menu is quite big, so you have a lot of functionality in this application. But let's see another one. It's exactly that case I talked about, a guy who created a forecasting application. Don't try to Google it because it's just something I came up with because he didn't like the idea of me presenting his software yet. So it's the web prototype I created for him so that we can demo it for his clients. So it has 4 grids here, and it has 2 charts, and again a top panel, and yeah, each grid is sortable, searchable. You can edit it, you can see one-to-many relationship in these 2 grids, like different activities for different forecasts, etc. So again, give it a little thought about how you would do this with Rails. Another showcase would be Yanit. It's a demo application I wrote for the last conference I spoke at in Kiev, in Dnipropetrovsk last year, and it's a prototype of an issue tracker, and you can see it can be pretty complex. It has multiple tabs which you can open, add, remove, and each tab has its own layout of different widgets like grids. And last, it's a little bit a special case. It's a desktop written with XJS. So basically, it looks like a desktop with a menu where you can start so-called applications, which are basically different apparently EXT components that have different functionality. So this one is deployed to Heroku. You can have a look how it works, as well as the previous one. So again, we come to the question, how do we do this? MVC. Alright, Rails forces us to use MVC in a way, right? So maybe you can see the whole thing that you see on the screen and the previous screenshots as a view. But in this case, a view has to be supported by a controller. But in this case, it doesn't fit too well because controllers are for data, right? So you might think of taking a different path and maybe use something which is recently released as Rails API Gem, which is an extraction of the Rails framework which doesn't use views at all. So basically you load the whole thing in JavaScript once at the initial load of the application, and then you use Rails through RESTful APIs, for example, to communicate to the server. So it would probably be a complete JavaScript loaded on an initial load of the application, right? Alright, so then in this case we would probably connect our two grids to different controllers on the server side, right? Let it be trucks controller and orders controller. And alright, that would probably work, because you would probably create a component in ext.js that would be a grid. You would implement sorting, etc., etc., and maybe configure it to connect to a specific controller. Right, but then our client comes and says, hey, you know, I need sellers to be able to log in too. So we need a different role of a user to connect to log into the same application, but have something different. So he adds, don't let them change or delete anything, right? Then you start thinking for the first time that basically it has to be a bit more complex than that. So we... by the way, I wanted to say just a quick pro tip. Treat your boss as your client. Probably some of you would put the word boss here instead of client, but I would say if you treat your boss as a client because he pays you money, you do your job, then maybe sooner or later your boss will become your client, and I'm sure for many of you that will be a case in some future. Or maybe it is already. Anyway, back to the story. So you would probably need to implement some authorization in your application and maybe remove some elements on your GUI, right? Or maybe you would even remove some columns from the grids. So maybe the sellers, they do not need to see some information from the database. So, and this kind of puzzling you, right? So you start thinking, how do I really do this? Okay, do I need to generate separate JavaScript per role? Well, you can imagine that it will lead to a lot of code duplication. Do you build the JavaScript dynamically? Again, you start thinking, but how does it really fit into the Rails conventions, right? Where would you how would you structure the code? Or maybe you would create configurable JavaScript so that the whole thing knows that, oh, I have a configuration option that is a different role, so we will do different behavior depending on who is logged in. But then what about server-side checks? Because removing a delete button doesn't necessarily mean that the user cannot hack the browser and send the request and delete data on the server. So the server has to check the security things as well. So it all leads you to some confusion, and you start thinking, how would you do this? And maybe some extra headaches would be when you realize that your application becomes so complex that it cannot be loaded at once. It's just too much. And maybe you realize that the more you put on the JavaScript side of your application, the less secure it becomes. Because it's just keep your most important business logic of the application on the server side. Then it will be much less to make it secure. Alright, so what I suggest is to think components. Because ext itself is a component framework in itself. So basically, whatever you see on the screen, different panels, trees, grids, etc., tab panels, they are components or widgets. So you can reuse them, you can use some created by Sencha for you, you can extend them, and you can compose them because Sencha ext.js provides really nice mechanism to lay out existing components. And it has a nice event system as well. So everything that you need to create to use the component approach to build a JavaScript application. But what's missing in this approach? Probably it's something like the way how you communicate to the server. So it would be nice if our component would have a way to talk to its part on the server and trigger some actions, get some response from the server. And maybe another thing that's missing is the server-driven configuration of the components. And here I will talk a little bit more. I suggest start to create a component from the server side, not from the JavaScript side. Why? Because the server knows about authorization, right? The server has the whole data which you will never ever be able to send to the client side, right? So maybe depending on data, you can have different behavior in the client. The server knows the business logic about what to do when, how to react on certain events, and maybe connects to some external servers, etc. And finally, server lets us write Ruby, right? So which might be probably more fun than writing JavaScript. So in general, I would say if we can combine client and server side in a component, that would probably be a nice thing. And because in this case we will get a single point of configuration, which means you don't have to configure your client side. For example, I don't want the delete button, right? And the server side, hey, if the delete request comes in, I don't want to react on it because, yeah, we shouldn't. But maybe you can just say prohibit delete operation, and then the client side will be configured properly, and the server side will also know what to do. So testability, you can just extract the component and test it separately in the browser, just as in this case. You can just take any piece of your complex layout and test it separately. Then it might become reusable, right? And a code encapsulation, in this case, I mean that once you write JavaScript for your component, you probably do not have to touch the JavaScript anymore because we're doing our development in Ruby. And these are the nice things to have, and it brings us to what Netzke provides us, right? So Netzke component is just a Ruby class, just as simple as this. And it runs, of course, on the server side, but it comes along with the corresponding JavaScript side class, which is run on the JavaScript side in the browser. So basically, this is the syntax EXTJS is using to define a component on the JavaScript side. So this code will be sent by Netzke to the client side after you decide to use this component in your application. So let's have a quick look about how instantiating of classes is working in EXTJS. Basically, you use another method of ext and you provide some parameters to instantiate a class panel in this case, right? And the result would be such a panel with the parameters, reflecting the parameters that we provide. And after this, it's just a JavaScript class, and you can call methods on it. You can say, hey, I want to change the title dynamically, and it just works. So this is what ext provides to us, right? But this is all JavaScript side. So what would Netzke, how would it help us here? Basically, you can instantiate in Netzke just the JavaScript side and provide the configuration options. And then it can generate for you the JavaScript configuration, which will be transferred to JSON and pushed to the client side. And this way you can configure the JavaScript side of your component. Maybe you still do not get immediately what the advantages of this would be. So how is it different from writing JavaScript side? But I can show you some example. Let's get back to Unit, for example. And these two panels here, they are Netzke components from a gem called BasePack, Netzke BasePack, and they allow you to quickly create grids like this, which have a lot of functionality in them, including sorting, CRUD operations, and editing in forms, multi-editing, etc. And let's say we do not have Netzke to do this, and then every column in a grid, it has specific options, right? You can have set the text of the column of the header. It can be editable or not, sortable or not, etc., etc. This is all supported by the client side of the component, right? So probably from the JavaScript, from the Ruby side, you would want to specify which columns you want this specific grid to use. And in Netzke you would do this like this. You just provide the model that you want this grid to be bound to. So this is active record model, for example. And you say, I want specific columns from this, right? And this is all that you have to provide to the grid panel component, so that it automatically detects what kind of data, what type of data is being handled by a specific column, right? So when you say, okay, so what is going to the JavaScript side as the columns configuration, right? It will be an extended configuration of the columns where depending on how the model issue is built, it will specify a specific editor. Like for the name it might be just a text field, but for the description it would be text area. For the priority it would be a number field, right? And it automatically adds an ID column just because, but it's hidden, right? So this is an example of how cool it is to be able to configure the the Ruby side of the component and let it do some intelligent work for you, right? So the client side of the component will be configured by the Ruby side, applying all this intelligence that you program in Ruby, in fact. All right, so this is more or less about how the grid panel works in Netzke. And the next aspect I want to talk about is inheritance. Very often you just wish that you create something and reuse it in a different place, but with a little bit modified behavior. But you all know that object-oriented programming is solving this problem. You can extend a class and add or modify some functionality, right? So Netzke allows you to do just this. So if we just inherit from simple component that we created before, we get the inheritance in Ruby side, but Netzke will provide you also with inheritance that is implemented in the EXTJS way, right? So Ext has a very nice class system which using prototype inheritance allows you to do this the same as well. So Netzke takes care that whenever you inherit from an existing component, it provides for you automatic inheritance on the JavaScript class. And I will demonstrate how you can use this on the next showcase, which brings us back to the forecast. So you see here two charts, right? Both charts, they display up to 4 lines of data. And both charts, they are related to amount of forecasts. Can we make it a little bit sharper, maybe? Right. Cool. So both of these charts, they share some intelligence. This is the key point here, right? They know that they have to deal with multiple forecasts for a specific activity. So basically, a chart shows, okay, we have a specific activity that we want to forecast, but there are different methods to forecast an activity, and it displays them all, right? Depending on which forecast you apply, it will display a different line, different results, and you want to see them on the same chart. So how would we do this? Basically, we would create 2 Netzke components called alright, so the difference between them, getting back to, is that one of them displays the data on the week scale and the other on the day scale, right? Alright, so how would we tackle this? So we create 2 components, week chart and a day chart, and we make them inherit from a component which we can call activity chart, which has lots of code, and it knows that it has to use the chart component from EXTJS class, and it just doesn't provide any data to the chart, but it knows how to display the lines, what are the styles, etc., etc. So it does the whole configuration of the EXT chart component. And then the only thing you have to do to extend or to let it display different data is to inherit from it and override the def method or the data method in the Ruby class. So you do not even have to touch the JavaScript part of it, and that's how you end up with two different charts, right? So the whole idea is, of course, to write less code. This is the whole point about me creating Netzke, so that you don't have to write JavaScript code all over again, and yeah, that's the main idea. Netzke has a lot of different aspects, right? And I only touched in details two of them, how you, maybe three, how you specify the class, how you instantiate it, and how you use inheritance. But besides this, it has also a composability aspect. So basically you can compose Netzke components as simple as you would do JavaScript in X case, using XJS, right? So it's very easy to combine components in Netzke. And it basically ends up being a new component, which you can combine or reuse or test separately, etc. This is very convenient if you think about this. Then it provides you server bindings. So basically each Netzke component knows how to communicate to its server side from the client and backwards, which means that you can isolate a specific component, make it work. Like, for example, a grid panel would do all the sorting or data updates, CRUD operations. It's all within this component. You don't have to care about setting up a separate controller and so on. You just do both Ruby and JavaScript codes. They are kind of bound together in one component. It also provides you dynamic loading of components as well. So however complex your application is, you do not have to send the whole JavaScript code to the client at the same time. Whenever user needs a new component, it can be dynamically loaded for you from the server and displayed in the browser. And I'm coming basically to the conclusion of this. Using Netzke allows or is meant to help you write structured and dry code, right? It enables OOP. Even I remember there are a lot of discussions about OOP on the controllers level in Rails, and it's still going on that it's not real OOP. So here you have the components that really allow you to use OOP. It has JavaScript code encapsulation. A cool thing, when you create a component, let's say you know XJS pretty well, so you are probably a good guy to create components, right? But then you come to your fellow developer who's only Ruby, right? And you say, hey, look, I have this gem, it has a set of components I created for you, and you just write Ruby classes and Ruby code to combine those components and use them. You don't have to know X code, and if something breaks or something doesn't work as expected, just come back to me. And it's looks pretty much like desktop development for web. However boring that might sound, but in many cases it's nice to know that basically your components are isolated pieces of code which you can develop separately, and it pretty much reminds you of the desktop way of developing things. And well, I encourage you to check it out, and that's pretty much it, my presentation.